He has been a researcher especially focused on Afghanistan and Pakistan for 10 years now, has an incredible network of contacts that he's tapped to really extraordinary effect over the years, also in some difficult to access Taliban areas. So it's similarly a unique asset. It's very exciting to us that they've come together to write this. And Scott Smith, to my far left, is a senior technical expert currently at USIP. For 15, 17 years before that, he has bounced back and forth between roles at USIP and roles with the United Nations, including as the UNAMA political director in Kabul until 2017, I believe. He first went to Afghanistan in 1994 doing relief and development work, and has been engaged all but continuously on issues concerning Afghanistan since then. And so I think first I will turn to Ashley to tell us some about the report, and then we'll go to Amiri to follow up.
Great, thank you, Johnny, and thank you for such a complimentary introduction I should hope to live up to. And I should also thank USIP for supporting this report, as well as the Norwegian government for actually funding all of this research. But as Johnny said, I want to begin by giving an overview of why we chose to do this research, where it came from. So Amiri and I we've in our own ways, separately, independently of one another, investigated how the Taliban works and what it's like to live in areas where the Taliban has influence and control. And what we've seen over the past year, 2 years, is more coherence, the same sorts of rules and policies being implemented in different places in the country, a sense of the shadow government that they had long touted actually kind of looking like a cohesive entity in some ways, at least. And so what we found ourselves asking was, okay, where did these rules come from? Where did this coherence, such as it is, come from? And what factors shape and influence the rules that the Taliban is trying to implement? Because, of course, in the context of any peace talks, that's what you want to be able to influence. That's what you want to be able to understand. And Amiri and Scott will, Amiri and Scott will talk more about the sort of practical implications and the political landscape. But I just want to give an overview at the outset of the research and some of the most relevant findings. But also to say, before I do that none of this is to normalize or legitimize what the Taliban is doing or seeking to do, or to render really any judgment, but to underscore that this comes from a place of, this is something we need to understand. Millions of Afghans, if not tens of millions of Afghans, are affected in one way or another. And so what we've really tried to do is look at that experience, look at what that means, and hopefully provide some insight for policymakers and others to take forward. So as anyone who's worked in a bureaucracy or has tried to influence policy-making processes will tell you, and as I underestimated at the outset, policymaking is incredibly messy, regardless of how the official process is supposed to work. In reality, there are people at multiple levels inside government or an organization and outside that organization who seek to influence the rules and the way they're enforced. The same is true, of course, of the Taliban. And it's that messy process that we had to figure out how to trace. So how we did that was we conducted over 100 interviews with people inside the Taliban, so people on the military side at all levels, on the more quote-unquote civilian side, working on sort of things like health, education, and so on. And then we also tried to talk to people who had or had tried to influence Taliban policy in those sort of circles outside the movement or somehow connected to the insurgency. And that could be village elders, that could be mullahs, that could be NGO officials, that could be high-level Taliban interlocutors, that could be UN officials. So we really tried to sort of trace who was in this big circle of influencers and actors within Taliban policymaking. We also looked at Taliban public statements. So they have a website, they have a Twitter feed. Afghanistan Analyst Network has translated their code of conduct. That's publicly available, but of course they're their most important documents aren't public. What the rules really are isn't disseminated outside the movement. But what we tried to do was obtain some of that. So we obtained the Taliban policy on education and on the military commission, which hadn't been public. I hadn't seen them before, to really try and understand, okay, these are the rules they've written down. Are they what's being implemented? How are those shaped? How can we trace where that comes from and how that's evolved? And finally, we chose 3 sectoral case studies to try and illuminate these processes. So we looked at health, education, and civilian casualties. And we use these as kind of case studies to really understand, okay, how is policy made in different sectors at different times? So that's essentially what we did. And I'll talk more about these case studies in a moment because I think there are important lessons to be drawn. But to start the discussion, I think we have to start at the beginning of the Taliban. I won't give like an exhaustive encyclopedic history of the group, but it is important to understand how they got from a couple of fighters in pockets of the south and east when I first arrived in Afghanistan in 2008-9 to where they are now. Because I think if you had told me that I would be sitting up here talking about this, that this would be a reality we're now facing, I would not have believed you then. So what we do in the report, and it's a device, it's a useful device in terms of thinking about this, is we break down the Taliban's organizational development into 3 waves. And these waves are not necessarily linear or, they're sort of overlapping, but it's a way of seeing how they made different shifts at certain times. So the first wave is roughly 2005 to 2008, and that's when they're sort of a nascent insurgency. They're disorganized. They're just starting to build command structures. I mean, you have these sort of fighting groups popping up in various places, but you don't have a unified movement yet. And there is a move to try and, there's Mullah Omar's Eid statements, which were probably the Taliban's first sort of policy statements, and these were short statements, messages to fighters about what kind of conduct was allowed, what the priorities of the movement were in that period, and these were disseminated to journalists, but they were also read out in mosques and things like this at the local level. You also have the first Leha, the Code of Conduct for Fighters, which is a short document which sort of says who to kill and who not to kill, don't steal, all these kinds of things, the basic sort of command and control essentials. But for the most part, on the ground, Taliban fighters are making things up as they go along. Now, in the second wave, which starts roughly 2008-9, the Taliban begins to expand. It expands throughout the east, the north. You have pockets in the west. And what happens is they start to sort of play around with policy and with developing civilian governance mechanisms. You have shadow governors that are primarily military, but there's still sort of a function of governing the population. And you have another sort of set of ad hoc initiatives, but they're again sort of making it up as they go along. What you see happen, though, is some strategic thinking start at the top. So you have the Leha, this code of conduct, revised twice in this period. It expands dramatically, and it talks about shadow commissions for education, for example. They sort of introduce this language of a shadow government all of a sudden. And while it's not necessarily reflected on the ground, there are pieces of it that you can sort of trace and identify. But what happens then is the U.S.-led military surge. So while the Taliban starts to sort of gain ground, they immediately get knocked back and they suffer. And they have to reorganize and they have to rebuild until you have the drawdown. And that is sort of the third wave, the drawdown through the present. And with the drawdown of international forces and the handover of security responsibility to Afghan forces, the Taliban expands dramatically, right? They expand not only in control, but in influence, this sort of strategy of creeping control in areas of the country. And they start to really think about how to govern civilian populations. They set up civilian governance positions for real. They set up policies for real and try to implement them. And externally, of course, they start to try and cultivate an image of a government in waiting. They open up a political office in Doha. They engage in talks sporadically, and now, over the past year or 2 years, more consistently. Internally, though, they're refining the rules. They're building structures. They're striving for coherence and hierarchical control. And they impose a division of labor, which looks a lot like any government. I mean, they sort of mimic the structures of the Afghan government and seek to replicate them. They seek to co-opt healthcare and education. And they break down military units. We talk about this more in the report. They introduce red units, special forces, which make the sort of local Taliban fighters somehow more accountable to the leadership. They introduce things like school monitors and all these kinds of things. And the real point here, the most interesting point for me, is that policymaking is not about necessarily the normative function. So, it's not about just imposing rules at any cost or about the ideology. It's about building structures and building a coherent movement and creating gradually sort of this political entity that's able to function as one. I don't know that it's necessarily always, there. I wouldn't overstate the coherence of the Taliban, but that's what this process, I think, was about in many ways. And so with that as a backdrop, I want to talk a little bit about the case studies. And I don't want to talk about each one in depth. I mean, the report is quite long, and it goes into healthcare, education, and civilian casualties in some detail. But I want to talk about 3 main lessons that we drew from these case studies and what they told us about the way that the Taliban makes decisions. So the first is about the content of policy. So we had these 3 case studies, and what they told us is that not all policies are shaped in the same way. They're shaped by some of the same imperatives, but how those imperatives and dynamics play out differs according to the substance of what you're talking about. So, for example, military concerns are the dominant factor that shapes policy. That's no surprise. It's an insurgency, right? It's always going to be about waging war. But how those military concerns manifest, how the Taliban perceives military threats vis-a-vis the policy area you're talking about, will vary. So healthcare was never seen as a threat ideologically or militarily, so there was never any opposition to healthcare. That's not true of education, for example, right? So education was state education at least, was seen as an ideological threat at the outset of the insurgency, so it was subject to more regulation, more attacks. Attacks on schools were called for and indeed permitted for a long time until the Taliban shifted towards an attitude of co-opting and regulating things. Certainly with dealing with protection of civilians' concerns, if you're advocating for human rights concerns and civilian casualties, you're going to face different arguments around military imperatives than you would in other sectors. Ideological concerns as well were quite important, but again, how this played out varied. With education, of course, ideological concerns were at the forefront of the Taliban's mind, but when it came to healthcare, there were almost no ideological objections, and that's very different than I think what you see elsewhere in other insurgencies. So again, it matters what you're talking about. It also matters who you're talking to. Different actors within the movement will have different areas of influence. So, for example, religious scholars will have a heavy influence on justice and education, but very little place in, again, healthcare. So if you're seeking to influence a policy, you need to understand how that policy is viewed and who has sort of the remit to influence it inside the movement. The second point I want to make is about variation and local accommodation. And this is kind of a tricky one, because what we argue is that there's a degree now, at this point in the insurgency, of centralized hierarchical policymaking and decision-making. But that within that, there's room for adaptation and local variation, which I'm sure sounds a little bit waffly and contradictory, but here's what I mean. So there's a broad education policy, but it is implemented in different ways in different areas of the country. There are various anecdotes in the report about a provincial governor, shadow provincial governor, or shadow district governor implementing the most lenient or the most extreme version of a Taliban directive, or simply ignoring it, saying, the security situation won't allow us to do that. And often those security imperatives act as a convenient excuse not to do something they don't want to do. But the point here is that there's a logic and there's a function to this variation. It's intentional. The Taliban sets rules at the top at this point, allowing local commanders and local constituencies some flexibility and variation. And they do this because policymaking is about cohesion. It's about keeping everyone inside the tents. So the leaders at the top in various factions know that you have to accommodate the sort of wide array of preferences within sort of these areas and within the diverse opinions and positions that make up the Taliban in order to sort of keep the movement together. And the third and final point is about the influence that outside actors can have on Taliban policies and rules. And outside actors, increasingly over time, have been able to influence Taliban rules, but not necessarily who you might think. So civilians have been able to influence Taliban policy in very important ways. They weren't always able to do so, but where they were well organized, where they were able to sort of muster bargaining power, they've been able to advocate for clinics to reopen, for schools to reopen, for girls to go to school, for various protection concerns to be addressed. And certainly as the Taliban has been more concerned about legitimacy and the perception that they're not just ruling by fear, they've wanted to cultivate the appearance of having some degree of consent. Whether or not that's actually true in practice, they want to cultivate that appearance. The international community was a mixed bag in terms of the degree to which they have been able to use their leverage to influence the Taliban. And there are a couple of points here. I mean, one example that we go into in the report is UNAMA Human Rights. They have had what I think is pretty formidable success in advocating protection of civilians' concerns to the Taliban. But this example is incredibly rare because what UNAMA Human Rights has done is they seized on a mutual interest with the Taliban to engage. They seized on the Taliban's desire for international recognition and legitimacy. They engaged with the Taliban over many, many, many years, consistently on a set of advocacy priorities. So pressure plate IEDs was one priority. It took many, many years to see any Taliban movement on this issue, but there has been. And when there has been movement on an issue, UNAMA Human Rights has, however subtly, recognized that. They've given the Taliban some recognition for moving on IHL and the laws of war. However, that is, again, incredibly rare when it comes to aid agencies and others. Aid agencies on the ground were able to sort of negotiate for things around education and health, but they are incredibly divided and fragmented. There hasn't been that kind of consistent high-level engagement at the strategic level on specific issues. There's been humanitarian engagement, there's been ad hoc initiatives, but there hasn't been that sort of consistent advocacy agenda to get the Taliban to move, say, on girls' education or this or that. And there are, of course, rational reasons for this. There are many risks and drawbacks to engaging the Taliban, certainly in the past, but there continue to be some. But what Amiri and I walked away with this, we felt that there were many missed opportunities in looking back at this policy development trajectory. And I think in those missed opportunities, that's where the most important lessons on how to move forward lie, about what can be differently done as and if political talks progress, as and if talks around humanitarian access change or intensify or get more strategic. I mean, I think these are the things that I know Amiri wanted to talk about, and I think would be worth talking about as we discuss. And I will hand it over to Amiri if he's actually online.
Yeah, we know there've been some blackouts in Kabul today, so it is possible that Amiri will come and go. But I think we have him on right now, though I can't actually see the screen. But Amiri, assuming you're with us, what would you have for us?
Thank you. I hope everyone can hear me.
We can. Did we lose him?
No.
I'm going to depend on the front row here because I can't see the screen. It's frozen. All right. Well, if it's frozen, and Amiri, hopefully you can hear me saying that it's frozen, maybe we could go to Scott next and see if the internet gods favor us 10 minutes from now.
Sure. Yeah, first of all, I want to make sure to distinguish myself from both Ashley and Amiri. Have not been on the ground in Taliban-held areas in quite some time, and referring to the title of the report, I'm much more bureaucrat than insurgent in this case. But
Hello.
Hey, we've got you back.
Finally.
All right. If we've got you, why don't we try it and take what we can get. Go ahead, Rahmatullah. It's good to have you here.
Thank you for having me. So, I mean, Ashley already talked a lot about the paper, described all how we came up with the idea and how we put everything together. So here, what I'm going to talk about is three things. One is when we talk about one is the institution, Taliban as an institution, as a mechanism, as a group. And then the second things that we need to talk about is the attitudes towards things, the attitudes of Taliban towards things. And the most important thing, are Taliban changed, especially at this time to 2019 and soon to be 2020, and the peace is going to be the hot topic. So before I would start with the Taliban as an institution, as a group. So I mean, throughout this study and other studies, we have come to, the Taliban have come a long way. They have changed quite significantly as institution or as a group, as a guerrilla group or as an insurgent group, as a, you can put it however you want it. They established, for example, in the last 19 years, they established mechanism. In the beginning, as you can see in the paper, there were no mechanisms, there was no system, there was nothing in place. Just a bunch of guys would come and try to overrun a place or stay somewhere, initiate an attack, and just then run away. There was no engagement with the community. There was nothing. There was no, for example, accountability, which doesn't exist to some extent even today, but still there is something than what was before. The other thing is strength, their command and control. If you look at the Taliban over the years, one thing you realize is that they have established as an incredibly strong command and control over their fighters. They come up with a very centralized system. Yet they invested a lot of power in their provincial governors and their provincial commissions. So it's a very interesting, group. On one hand, they made everything so centralized, but on the other hand, this centralization, you don't feel that centralizations. They control the provincial governors, and the provincial governor control the province. It's not like there are other groups in the province that could, pass the provincial governor positions and can reach the leadership. So that's a very interesting. So the place to look at it is they have a very centralized system, but yet quite invested power in their provincial governor. The other things they did over the years, when you read the paper, is that the Taliban, one thing they really understood was context. Afghanistan is a contextual country. You have to understand, for example, East, West, South, every region has its own dynamics. So Taliban realized that and really come up with strategies, policies, taking all those dynamics into considerations. For example, in Paktia, they did not close the schools, but for example, in East, and Southeast, I would say, so that way that would be easy for you to understand. In Southeast of the country, they allow educations, but in south of Afghanistan, like Kandahar, Helmand, and Uruzgan, they closed education system until 2019. So what they did was they really, when they were developing or they were coming to this current situations, they really took those contexts into considerations. And the other thing is that I want to talk about them is as they grow up as group or as an institution, as an armed group, or as a non-state armed group, is that they slowly started working with the humanitarian actors. I mean, the humanitarian actors engaged them for a very long time. But as Ashley stated, that that's very not so organized or coordinated with each other. Everybody tried to find their own guy to get access to their control. But especially in the last 3 years or 4 years, Taliban have really changed their approach to international to humanitarian actors and those work in the humanitarian sector. But there's one thing, it's development. There's very little engagement with the development sector still yet, which is kind of an issue still at this point in time. So now we see that Taliban has grown up as an institution, as a non-state armed group, quite significantly in the last 18 or 19 years. But the question is, our Taliban attitude has changed. That's the main question that we need to this point in time, because Taliban have proven that they have changed significantly in terms of, but there's very little data and examples and that Taliban has changed their Taliban attitude has changed. For example, towards girls' educations. I mean, there are many statements that talk about girls' educations, women educations. They can go, but practically there has been very little done compared to other things. For example, health facilities. That's the one area where Taliban significantly has changed. Their attitude has changed from day one. It's not a new thing that so they allow clinics, doctors, in their control area. And the other question is that we were looking is like working with the civilian and their concerns. Where we have come, where Taliban were the weak, they really work out with the community. Where they were strong, they really did not care actually working with the community. So there is this examples of where they are weak, they work better with the community. Where they are stronger, they really did not take the community into consideration. For example, the example we could provide is Helmand, where they really have the elders community have no role whatsoever in playing any role in in anything in the Taliban governance structure. But the same thing, if you look at the southeast, you can see elders play a very crucial role in some areas. So now the third area is like that we wanted to look at are like the most important questions. Are Taliban really changed to work with other Afghans? That's the questions. I mean, we need to look at their policies, to their policies with the other Afghans, with the other groups, political parties, jihadi groups. Are they going to work are they going to work under a constitution, like how they are going to come together to work if there's any peace with other groups. This is the area that there has not been so much clarity from the Taliban side, especially at this very crucial time. I think it's very important for the Taliban to come out to actually really talk about these issues because a lot of Afghans living in Afghanistan have a lot of concerns. There's no doubt that they institutionally and internally they have they really come a long way. But attitude-wise, there are still quite a lot of concerns among the communities, politicians, and among their opponents, and everyone else living in the country. Over to you back, Johnny.
Great, thank you, Amiri. Scott, your moment has finally come.
Thank you. Picking up from where I left off, while this study was being worked on, USIP had also worked with the Afghan Analyst Network in Kabul to look at service delivery in Taliban-controlled areas in 6 different districts. So that was sort of looking at what are the actual results on the ground of the sort of policy making that you've been talking about. And I've been working on a report basically synthesizing those 6, which makes me maybe not qualified to speak on this issue, but a little bit familiar with some of the topics that are being discussed. And I should say at the beginning also, there's a remarkable consistency between what we found in those reports and what you found in your own research. But I hope I can add a little bit of value by talking also about what does this mean for a possible peace process, and maybe providing a slight beginning of an answer to Amiri's last question about can the Taliban work with other groups in Afghanistan, which they will have to do if there is going to be a sustainable peace. I also wanted to sort of situate this issue. What does it mean when we talk about Taliban-controlled areas? How much of the country are we talking about? And here there are a few different metrics, and mostly it was a special investigator for Afghan reconstruction who used to, in his quarterly reports, have an assessment of this, but that assessment was based on information provided by Resolute Support, which at the beginning of 2018 was classified. So the information we have is not that up to date, but more or less you could say the government controls about half of the country. The Taliban controls, and it corresponds more or less to population as well. Taliban controls 12 to 15%. And the rest is what we call, or what they call, contested area. This is fluid. It's not always easy to know what control is. I'll give you an anecdote, take it for what it's worth. But a few years ago when I was in Kabul, I was speaking with somebody who had recently been appointed as governor of a difficult province. And in that difficult province, there was a particularly difficult district far away at the edges of the province. And one of the first things that he did when he became governor was he wanted to talk to the district governor. So he told his aide, call that guy and set up a phone appointment with him because I want to talk about what's going on in that district and how we can improve things. 5 minutes later, the district governor came running into his office, and it turned out he had moved his district center in a container to the provincial governor's compound. So there was no need for a phone call. He was right there. But that means if you say, well, control of a district center means control of the district, but the district center is in the provincial capital, then you can see how this issue of what territorial control actually means can be debatable. But the trends are, the Taliban have consolidated, it seems, their control in the areas where they are present. And that this share has gradually decreased since around 2011 when our withdrawal began. Why is it important that we understand what is going on in this 12 to 15% of the country? And I would argue that this report would have been useful, even more useful maybe 10 years ago, because it tries to help us understand what this insurgency is about. Is it a movement that has political objectives, or is it just about getting rid of foreign troops? Does it have any local legitimacy, or does it rule mostly by fear and intimidation? And in the early days of when we began hearing about Taliban showing up in rural areas, it was about fear and intimidation. Is their objective to deny the Kabul government legitimacy by undermining the service provision, or are they trying to replace that government? And you will remember, those of you who were following this in the heyday of counterinsurgency, our theory of change was that the government gains legitimacy by providing services, so by extension you would think the Taliban denying those services would deny the government of legitimacy. And I think the story that is told in Ashley and Amiri's report is a story of changed objectives and an evolution where I think they began with much more minimalistic kinds of objectives, but as they gained territory, they had to adapt, and they had to develop these new mechanisms and policies and control that you're talking about. Then, I mean, in fact, the whole process reminded me, as I was reading it, especially the first chapters, of descriptions by historians of the development or the emergence of the nation state from medieval Europe, where you would have these sort of barons who would try to get a little bit more control against their rivals, but getting control of territory meant that you had to have people more or less on your side, or at least not rebelling against you, and then suddenly you're saddled with responsibilities, the need to develop new institutions to keep them happy, but also the need to develop taxation to fund your own expansion. Without taking that metaphor too far, that was sort of what it reminded me of. And here we see this very clearly in the changes I think you've both mentioned on education policy. At the beginning, a school was seen as a manifestation of the government, and the policy of the Taliban was to destroy the school. It was to intimidate teachers, and if they didn't stop teaching, to kill them, and this happened. Once you begin controlling more territory, and you realize that people want some kind of education for their children, well, then you end up providing that education. And that was not just, I would say, a pragmatic shift. That was a major ideological shift as well. Now, of course, they changed the curriculum as well, and they began putting their own people in as teachers, but nonetheless, the idea of co-opting schools instead of destroying them was a major sort of shift. And through these kinds of changes, we began to map, again, the evolution of the objectives from something that was fairly not minimalistic, but focused on the military and focused on opposition to the government and to the international forces, into something a bit more complex and a bit more institutionalized, as you've described. Another service, you could say, that the Taliban have provided that you don't talk about as much, but has been a factor, something that USIP reports, I think, beginning a decade ago, began to notice, which is the so-called provision of justice. And again, you can find medieval echoes in this, but early on, the Taliban would provide a sort of form of justice that was, we would call it brutal, but it had the advantage compared to the government justice provision that it was not seen as corrupt, and the Taliban had the ability to enforce the verdicts that they made. And in some of the ways, this was not so foreign to Afghan rural populations, so it was seen as preferable. And one of the early sources of legitimacy of the Taliban that allowed them, I think, to consolidate some of this control was the fact that they were able to gain the confidence of people through the provision of justice and through the settlement of disputes that the government was not able to do. This said, I mean, I also want to underscore the point that Ashley made. Nobody's saying this is a good thing, and to say that the Taliban have been somewhat effective at providing services is not to sort of lend them any kind of legitimacy of our own, but it's just to point out a reality, which is a reality that we will now have to deal with, and is a reality which has somehow forced the fact that we are now speaking to them directly about a peace process. Nonetheless, some of you I know were here on Tuesday, I think it was, for the launch of the Asia Foundation survey of the Afghan people, and if I remember correctly, that survey showed that actual perceptions of popularity of the Taliban is dropping and is now around, sort of hovering around 5%. So these are not popular, it's not a popular movement, but it's a movement that has gained, if not the support, the acquiescence of people in the territories where they control. And this comes out also in the Afghan Analyst Network studies. Unfortunately, it seems that service delivery in Taliban areas, and remember, they're co-opting financing, they're co-opting resources from the government to run the schools, to run the hospitals, and people on the ground feel that it's not much better in government areas than it is in Taliban areas. And that's a huge missed opportunity for the government, because they've had many more resources, and this was a chance to get people on their side. But instead, it seems that there's kind of a draw, and I'll quote here an interviewee from the Afghan Analyst Studies, who said, "There's no difference to me between the Taliban and the government, but if we just have one of them, it's better. If we have both, there's fighting." And that's a sort of a bit of an indictment of you know, how the government has been able or not been able to extend itself across the national territory. There's another slight difference between government areas and Taliban areas that we found in the Afghan Analyst Network studies, which is, and Amiri referred to this, the Taliban are a bit more responsive, or much more responsive in some cases, to demands from the ground. When they're not strong, they have to listen to communities, and they react to that. Government officials tend to be much more aloof and much more likely to abuse power. So that's one other reason why I think in some areas people feel that they'd rather deal with the Taliban, because if they have a grievance, it's more likely to be taken up and addressed. Let me conclude with just a few thoughts on what this means for a peace process. So what happens if the Taliban finally sit down with the government to talk about a new political order. And during those talks, there's sort of hopefully a ceasefire. This was at least what apparently was agreed between President Trump and President Ghani over Thanksgiving. But let's assume that's the case. The positive thing about what you describe is that, given that in many ways the Taliban are sort of trying to govern and using existing government resources, in some areas there can be a smooth continuation, especially if we have a freeze-in-place ceasefire where the Taliban basically continue to more or less run the areas where they are present and the government run the areas where they're present. So in health, I think you'd have a kind of a continuity. There are a few areas where there will be some problems. One of them is education, because the Taliban, as I say, have changed the curriculum. They've limited girls' access to schooling. And over the long run, the country will need to have a common curriculum, and obviously limitations on schooling of girls beyond the age of 12 is not among the gains I think we would like to see preserved in any sort of peace agreement. The more difficult issue is, of course, what I described before, the issue of justice, because the Taliban have their own version of Sharia. They don't have the civil courts. They don't respect the Constitution. And there's a wide divergence between the way the government tries to apply justice and the way the Taliban do. Somehow that will have to be worked out in negotiations, but it would mean basically two very different systems of justice on the ground coexisting for the duration of the elections, if that's the way things go. Basically, then, just to really conclude, I think as we try to envisage what a post-negotiation peace will look like, I think one of the key ingredients of it is what a current Taliban governance on the ground looks like, because that will have to be compromised with the constitutional order and so forth. And if I said this would have been useful 10 years ago because it would have helped us understand the insurgency much better, it's certainly useful now as we look forward to what a peace agreement might look like.
Great. Thank you, all three of you. Maybe I'll pick up on this peace process element as the overriding policy question that we in this town, at least, are doomed to grapple with. So maybe we could get at it this way. Let's imagine a very happy scenario in which talks are happening and some of the national level political issues, like potential agreement, is starting to come into focus. That itself does not answer the extremely complex question of what becomes of this huge apparatus that you and Amiri have laid out in your paper. And it's not only the kind of substantive policies that have to be reconciled with each other. It's this huge network of people within the Taliban bureaucracy that, especially in the written report, you describe Mahaz like local military commanders who are used to some degree of decision-making authority, and religious figures who are used to being consulted about important decisions before policy moves forward. And for that matter, red units, like Taliban special units, they're used to enforcing serious policies. So what, if anything, can you say about how this whole apparatus might somehow constructively find a future, in a post-peace Afghanistan? And maybe I'll start with Ashley, and then Amiri, I should say. I can hear you, they can see you, but I can't. So whenever you'd like to weigh in, please do, and just do it verbally, and I'll hear that.
Well, maybe I'll start off and let Amiri come in and correct or amend anything I've said. Okay, so one of the things that I find incredibly interesting, and it's not unique to the Taliban, the Tamil Tigers, many insurgent groups do this, but it's mimicry, basically. So the Taliban have mimicked and co-opted what already exists. I mean, that's a very smart and practical approach when you have to govern or look like you're governing territory. So healthcare and education are really interesting in this regard. So I've talked to a lot of provincial and district healthcare and education people on the government side, and talk to them specifically about their relationship with the Taliban, right? Because they have to work together, either directly or indirectly, to make sure those services keep flowing to Afghans, right? So it's in everyone's interest to keep the schools open, to keep the clinics running, to keep the midwives working. And the Taliban pushed them. They pushed them for more. They pushed them for, whatever. But there is, I haven't found the precise language. I often rely on shadow government or parallel administration, but that's not true. That's misleading. What the Taliban has done is tried to suck in the government and the aid community's resources to its own ends. And local health officials, they're crafty. They're dedicated civil servants, many of them working in the basic services, who are trying to sort of keep things going. And there are many examples of people I've talked to, but the one I keep coming back to is there was this written MOU in Helmand on education provision between someone in the Ministry of Education in Helmand and someone on the Taliban side in the Commission for Education in Helmand. And they signed an MOU about this is how we're going to govern schools. Now, that's deeply uncomfortable in some ways, right? Because as you hinted, it requires compromises and concessions, but it's what civil servants on the government side and people on the Taliban side are doing, at least to keep services going. And the Taliban's attitude, if you call up the Taliban spokesman, as I have, and ask him, okay, this is kind of funny. You're working with the government, but yet at war with them. And they make a very fine distinction now, which was not always there. And this distinction is, the government, the services, the obligations to Afghan people, people in the Ministry of Health and Ministry of Education and Ministry of Mines, we don't attack those people. Those people were on the same side because we're all working for Afghans. This is their narrative, right? Say what you will about it, but that's that. If we're talking about a framework for peace, okay, maybe there's some opportunity to open up dialogue between the government at the highest levels and the Taliban at the highest levels on health or on education, because quite frankly, they're already working together in a way. And I think that's important to recognize. I've done a lot of work on justice over the past year. Amiri has done separate work as well, and that's an area which is fairly irreconcilable, where you have two very, very different systems and where the Taliban has built something completely separate and still considers prosecutors, judges, policemen, anyone affiliated with the justice system to be a legitimate target. So that is sort of the opposite problem that you're going to face. But that's what I would briefly say about that incredibly large and complex question you laid out for us. And hand it over to Amiri if he's still online.
I just want to add is that the one thing is that you would find quite interesting is the way the Taliban put the check and balance against their top provincial leadership is incredibly amazing. The provincial commission and the provincial governor, these are the two top positions, and how they work with each other and complement each other. I think that for the future, for any peace deal, I think that could be, part of any peace deal that happens between the Afghan government and the Taliban eventually. And the other thing is, as Ashley talked about, is the education and health sector. Basically, it's the same education system, just only that one group is appointed by the government, the other group is appointed by the Taliban. So when there's a peace, one group has to go. Whoever goes, that would be decided based on the negotiations. So in education, health, civilian casualties, for example, NGO commission so these are almost literally the same, kind of duplicate of each other. The one thing is that the Taliban system is quite smaller. There are very few people working in this, whereas the government is quite big and dense. So I see a lot of areas where they could work work together, and they could actually benefit from each other, could complement each other. The only thing is the justice system that is quite different. I mean, Taliban doesn't have there's no written laws like any. So what they do is normally when a person comes to them, they ask him to go write the Surat Dawa. It's an Arabic term. It's like write your case study. So the guy goes to a religious scholar, and the religious scholar write him and then the Taliban judge also asked the oppositions to go and write Dafitawa, meaning that go defend your case. So the guy goes again to a religious scholar to write his case. So that's whereas in Afghan systems, where in the Afghan government we have written laws, we have a lot of areas, So that would be a bit challenging in the future. But others, most of the governance, that's easily workable and complementing actually each other.
Great, thank you. Anything? No. Another question. So one of the most common narratives that we hear about the Taliban is that they are controlled or heavily influenced by outside actors. Pakistan being the most common, some would extend that to Iran and Russia. I'm struck in this very in-depth conversation of kind of one of the main things that the Taliban do. I don't think the word Pakistan has even come up. And I would just be interested if in either body of research you detected any substantive influence of an outside actor in how the Taliban make key decisions of this kind.
Well, I don't think they would have survived without that safe haven next door. So I think, yeah, I would leave this to Amiri and Scott, but I don't think outside actors are terribly concerned with the education system or the political platform domestically that the Taliban seeks to implement. I mean, that's not my perception of what they seek to influence. I don't know, Amiri, what would you say to that? It's a really tough question.
Questions are not popular.
I mean, the one things from the experience on the ground, and there's very little outside interference or pressure or influence on the Taliban. I mean, by nature, Taliban are kind of opposed to any foreign influence. This is like by nature. Even in 1990s, if you study them, yes, the problem that they are exposed to those pressures because of they live in Pakistani cities, and so they are. But they didn't allow those interference to a large extent, to influence their decision. And the other thing is when they make these kind of decisions, especially education, health, and civilian, these decisions or policies are normally the idea come up from the ground inside Afghanistan. It's not that they will have to impose, especially in the past, that those who are sitting outside of the country would make the policy and would bring it. Yes, military policy were normally coming from that side, but when civilian, with these kind of civilian policies like education, health, there's very little influence and interference from the outside. And it's Taliban are actually, to a large extent, actually defended in many areas. To not not allow these kind of interference in their system.
I mean, I just add, I did have something in my remarks on Taliban on Pakistan that I left out. To take Ashley's point, I think obviously without these sanctuaries, and those who study insurgency theory know the importance of sanctuaries to survivals of insurgencies, they certainly would not have been able to survive, those early years, and maybe they would not be able to survive right now if those sanctuaries were removed. I think the significance of what's in this report is to what extent do they have sanctuaries now inside Afghanistan that they are able to sort of defend and to some extent, live off of. Obviously, at the end of the day, you need supply lines, and that's what Pakistan allows. But the real development here has been the development of these spaces inside Afghanistan, where I think they can feel, relatively secure.
maybe I'll just ask one more before going to the crowd, potentially a little bit lighter, but I mean, you and Amiri have presumably had such a fascinating experience researching this in prior papers, and I'm just interested in atmospherics that might have surprised you, have, I don't know, been different from what you expected, but that didn't make it into the paper, either from just observing some of these areas of Taliban control. I'm reminded in the time when we spoke previously, you mentioned within 5 minutes of leaving the airport at one of Afghanistan's major cities, you saw the Taliban flags up, and that would have been unthinkable a few years ago. So either from traveling these areas or just talking to people living under it, what surprised you? What did you learn?
Well, I think there's a lot that didn't make it into the report, and at one point there was like a 250-page draft, thanks to Amiri, which I blame him entirely for. But I think, you know, the thing for me as a researcher to be able to go and to see things, it's not, I'm always very jealous of Amiri because he obviously has better access for a million reasons than I ever will. And he gets to see all of this and absorb it. And so he understands those dynamics much more. But for example, when I was in Faryab, I mean, I think this was the example you were talking about in February. I took a trip to Faryab and Herat, and I hadn't been to Herat since 2011. And I couldn't believe that, you know, 20 minutes away from the airport in Herat City, this bastion of what I had thought was, I don't know, if not calm, at least some sort of stability and political order, there were Taliban, that there were Taliban notices in the bazaar in Herat City. I mean, it's just, so this creeping influence, and the title of the AAN project, One Land, Two Rules, sort of encapsulates the enormous pressures that Afghans are under. Even when you're living in a city under government control, you know, chances are you have a family outside of that city, you're going back and forth, you're crossing these lines all of the time. And so the incredible thing to me is just how, like, strong and resilient and brave and risk-taking a lot of Afghans just have to be by nature of living under these conditions, of crossing these lines, of having to have relationships on both sides of the conflict, because you never know what's going to happen to you or your family members, or, you know, how you're going to get them out of an NDS prison or a Taliban prison, or what exactly the next day holds. And so, I mean, Scott cited a quote from one of the AAN profiles of, okay, if it's the Taliban, if it's the government, it doesn't even matter anymore as long as it's just one of them, because people are so exhausted. And you really can kind of understand it. But even underneath that exhaustion, there's like this incredible ability to continue negotiating, to continue to fight for sort of the future of their country or for their families or whatever that means for them. So I'm always both equally in awe and humbled on the one hand, but also incredibly depressed after I go to these places about how bad things are for a lot of people. But I don't know, maybe Amiri has a more lighthearted story.
Whether lighthearted or not, anything to add, Amiri?
Yeah, just, I mean, one thing that I was shocked is that how much even the Taliban didn't know about their own system was quite surprising to me. You know, you see people talking about Taliban civilian governor and then military governor. You talk about the district civilian governor, and so then I was like looking into the papers, then kind of checking their actual papers, and then actually talking to the local population and also to the ground, you know, fighters and commanders, and then it really surprised me that it's not the people that they don't know much about the Taliban. It's actually some of the Taliban themselves don't know about these things because they're more focused, especially the military side. They're more focused on fighting. The other things which left out is accountability. I mean, I was quite shocked with the way they put the systems in place for accountability, improving their system, and how to keep military guys from engaging with the civilians. You know, so those were some of the points that actually were quite interesting to me to see that it's actually these guys have come a long way.
Great. Maybe we'll go to the audience. Why don't I do 2 at a time to start, if that's all right, to try and get more people in. And for efficiency, maybe the 2 in this row.
Yeah, so to build off of what you had just were talking about the sort of the daily weariness of the Afghan people, and also you had talked earlier about like support versus acquiescence, right? So I guess I wonder, like, is there any agency between those two of sort of delegitimizing Taliban rule where it creeps in just on behalf of the Afghan civilians themselves? Like, what are their options between support and acquiescence, if there are any?
Yes, I'm interested in revenue generation, especially taxes. Where does the money come from? When it comes in locally, where does it go? And if it goes to a central place in Quetta or Peshawar, how does it come back? And a corollary to revenue management is, what about financial corruption? We've heard a lot about the corruption of the central government. What about the corruption of the insurgent government? Thank you.
Anyone like to start?
Well, just to answer your question first, it's funny you should ask that. I just am in the middle of completing a PhD on that very idea, like what is the notion of support, and all of the language around this is very fraught, right? It doesn't necessarily convey the lived experience of having to negotiate all this. And so I think it's very much about bargaining. Afghans have had to survive between, whether it's Mujahideen factions, the communist government, they've had to negotiate between people. And that's all Afghans generally seem to do, is like negotiate and work relationships and try and influence, and in politics, and it's the way that you survive, is that you try and negotiate. So I would very much construe Afghan civilians as actors, even when they're acquiescing. Like, I think there's still people try, and of course there are people who try and play both sides against the middle, or businessmen who cooperate with the Taliban because it serves their interests, even if it empowers and legitimizes the Taliban or whatever else. So I think it's important to sort of, I do struggle with this when I'm writing about it or talking about it, to convey how exhausted and how depleted many people appear to be, but they're still fighting in a way. They're still angling and negotiating for their own survival and their families, I think. The taxation question is a very, very good one. I might throw that over to Amiri, simply because it's incredibly complicated.
Yeah. Sure. So with regards to the taxation, so the money, let's say where the money comes from. So one is Ushar, Ushar is number one. Then second is when they capture, things from Afghan government or anybody. So they sell that, they sell that and make money out of that. Then donations, and then taxing NGOs and INGOs and other humanitarian organizations. And then sometimes we call it the random taxing, which once in a while, when they need money, they impose everyone has to pay a certain amount of money to pay. So these are some of the ways that they make money. So one thing is you need, so taxation also evolved over the time. In the past, each mahaz was responsible for their own fighters. They had to find money from wherever. The central body of the Taliban would contribute very little to their, their income. But recently, with the Taliban become more organized and more, coherent, what they did is that, so all these money that taxing donations, Ushar, capture, these things that actually goes to the provincial governor. And then the provincial governor actually, with the help of the military commission, actually decides what to do and how to do. So there's a clear guideline they have for this. It's very detailed. They have for this, how it can be divided among. So it doesn't go to quite a very little amount, or sometimes when the amount is big, then normally the ones that goes to Quetta is donations, or coming from other countries or other key people. negligible, which the amount is big. It can be weapons or it can be money, both. So it's both Quetta and the provincial governor, and along with the provincial commission. So there are two bodies that actually, along with the military commissions, that controls this taxations and the money overall.
Just two quick additional points. One, obviously, is still the importance of illicit drugs as a revenue source. And on the question of corruption, one hears different narratives. On one side, that the Taliban are not at all as corrupt as the central government. On the other one, that they are, it's just they have fewer resources to be corrupt with, so it doesn't look as egregious as it does with the national government. But I don't know if you have a sense of where the needle is on that spectrum.
No, I think those are important points. So with larger industries like the opium trade, that's sort of a different ballgame, right? And of course there's corruption, but as Amiri said, they've really tried to institute accountability. So what that means, and accountability to whom, it's accountability upward, right? But their whole appeal to the civilian population is about their morality and their values and their incorruptibility. So I think they do take things like this quite seriously. They do happen. They always happen, right? But I think they try to perpetuate sort of, to live up to their brand, so to speak. But
another round. Could we go? We'll start with Bill, and then we'll go in the back and to the gentleman in blue.
Thanks. It's a great piece of work and really impressive. Two quick points and then a question which may be a little bit in the weeds. I very much agree with Amiri's point that there are more areas for common ground, and just to highlight, some of them are outside the area of your research, e.g. private sector, public finance, a whole bunch of issues where there might be some room for mutual working together. Second, the interesting contrast between education and health, and Scott will be aware of this, of course, is that this was very much evident in the 1990s. And donors, the international donors, what little aid they provided, it was allowed to go to health, and basically much more standoff with education. Now, the heritage of that was that there was then the government, after 2001, had a very, skilled, let's say, or successful NGO-based basic health delivery system, whereas on education, they had the more traditional statist type of approach where every teacher is a government servant, civil servant. Now, my question is, I think you've articulated really well how the different ideological views on education and health influence things. Do you see any influence on the way the Taliban operate from these radically different government models of service delivery, which they took on and co-opted?
Yeah.
Hi. I'm Andrea Jackson, and I did my dissertation at SAIS on Afghanistan, and I love the work that you're doing. When I was doing mine, I was looking at the actions of the Taliban and the government and local elders who ran these three different rule systems, basically. And one of the things that struck me was the effectiveness of the Taliban organization in controlling the behavior of its personnel. And I have this sort of idea that it has to do with the madrasa system and the way that they're indoctrinated. Did you see any evidence of the extent to which Taliban fighters or even the Taliban personnel that you were interviewing had been educated at Deobandi madrasas, giving them kind of a rhythm of what the norms were that they were enforcing?
And could you pass the mic directly or through an intermediary? Sir.
Yeah, hi, Phil. I worked for a year in Turkmenistan. We had a lot of Afghan refugees. Scott, indicated about 65% of the population, the area was controlled by Taliban or government. That leaves about 35% that we don't talk about. And the estimates I've seen of the warlords is about 20% are controlled. So we can't forget them. They're a very important part of this system.
So we have influence of the government model, we have influence of madrasa education, and we have the degrees of control with the warlords factored in. Who wants a piece of this?
Well, gosh, these are really hard questions, you guys. So just to pick up on Bill's point, on the technical elements, if I understand it correctly, of how the Taliban would deal with things differently, I think this is where they really lack expertise. They're enforcers. They know how to build systems. They know how to get people to obey. They know how to collect revenue. Do they know about the technical models of education? No. No, I don't think there are a lot of people inside. And certainly there are people inside the movement who have higher levels of education and experience than in the 1990s, who are maybe thinking about these things. That's my perception. But that's not on the forefront of what they're doing. I mean, they're using, again, these services as a tactic of political and military strategy, right? So I don't think they're delving into those questions. I don't think there's a huge technical difference, but I would defer to Scott and Amiri. On the madrasa question, I would absolutely defer to Amiri because he has the most intimate experience with those institutions, having grown up in Kandahar. And I obviously do not, having grown up in New York. But on the last point, on warlords, I don't have a good response to this, but to say that this is something I've been thinking so much more about. I don't think the international community has a real understanding of how dynamics have shifted in terms of the pro-government alliances under the Ghani Abdullah administration. You have seen huge shifts in the relationship between different people, whether it's Dostum, who I don't know what he controls anymore, honestly, other than a slice of Jawzjan, maybe Shabargat, but like that influence is almost gone, I think. Atta, Ghani, very much, it seems, disempowered Atta in a way that few would have foreseen a year and a half ago, whenever it was that happened. So these alliances of that other, for whoever makes up the rest of the pro-government side, it's really shifted from the days of Karzai, and I don't think there's a clear understanding of the political economy on the government side on how, beyond just the Ghani Abdullah dynamics, these other actors, what do they actually bring to the table? How have they lost? Where is their influence? When we talk about peace talks, I remember going into an office about a year ago in Kabul, and someone had written on a whiteboard, this is who we need in the tent on the government side. This is who we need in the tent, the peace tent, obviously, on the Taliban side. And the Taliban side had like 5 names, right? The government side had like 35. There wasn't enough room for all these guys. And I thought, well, I'm not sure many of these guys matter in the same way. So that's a question I would raise and a call for someone else to do really intelligent research on and tell me about. But I hand it over to Amiri and Scott.
Scott, you want to?
Sure. To Bill's point, I mean, one of the narratives that comes out of the Taliban control of education, for example, is that they're much more effective at monitoring it and preventing what we see on the government side, which are what they're called ghost teachers, which are teachers who are on the payroll, but they don't really exist. What we hear about, I think from your study and also the AAN one, is there is more accountability and sort of more close monitoring of that. On the health side, though, there are 2 issues. One, you have fewer Taliban who are actually health experts who know what they should be looking for, so monitoring is less effective there. And then you have a huge problem with women's health, because there are very few women doctors or nurses in Taliban areas, and certainly there are even fewer who are not in Taliban areas and who want to go and work under Taliban control. So there's a massive and kind of tragic disparity there, where some of the interviewees in the AAN study, are basically saying that if a woman gets sick, she will probably die, either because there's no health care or trying to get across these lines that you were talking about to get to somewhere where there is health care. So that's a huge issue, and one maybe that could be one of the first ones to be redressed if there were some sort of peace agreement. On the warlords, I would say that, this sort of third of the country that we talk about being contested is contested between government and Taliban, in the sense of a lot of battles going on and a lot of territory shifting back and forth rather quickly. The warlords, or as what we call warlords, as I think you hinted, have more or less been co-opted one way or the other into the Afghan government system, and then find their way. The whole narrative of governance from Kabul trying to either under Karzai mediate with them and form agreements, or under President Ghani, as you mentioned, with Atta, trying to actually undermine their power, directly. But the fact is, they're part of that ecosystem more than the contested ecosystem or the Taliban ecosystem.
And Amiri, if those beeps didn't signal something very ominous, could I give you the last word?
I couldn't hear properly the madrasa question, so I might not be able to answer that because of the bad internet connections. But with regards to the education system and those technical questions that Bill had, I would say that, if you look at Taliban has a very good understanding of the madrasa system. If you look at them, they really brought a lot of changes and they make it quite effective and interesting. But as Ashley says, yeah, they lack a lot of good understanding of the education system, and that's one of the area that a lot of people have concerns, is that, well, if there is a peace talk, if there's going to be a peace agreement, or if there's going to be any compromise, well, the Taliban will be like the same like 1990s, everything will be run by religious scholars? That's the question, that's the question that everybody posed. So, education is a sectors that they, to some extent they claim that they have a good understanding, but to a larger extent that they might not have. So that's a question for them, whether they would be willing to work with others in some of these areas.
Great, thank you. I'm sorry to the questioners that I've not gotten to, but I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Please join me in thanking Amiri, Ashley, and Scott for their extraordinary work. And thank you all for coming to USIP.